The radio crackled with static, then silence. Major Eric Hallbrook stood in the operations tent, staring at the topographical map spread across the table, his jaw tight. The valley below Firebase Keating was a maze of narrow gorges and terraced ridges, perfect terrain for an ambush. Intelligence had confirmed enemy movement, over 200 insurgents, heavily armed, converging on the firebase from three directions. The firebase held only 70 soldiers, undermanned and undersupplied, clinging to a position that military analysts had already deemed indefensible. Hallbrook's fingers traced the contour lines on the map, searching for something, anything, that might turn the tide. Above him, the canvas ceiling rippled in the cold mountain wind. Outside, soldiers reinforced sandbag positions and checked ammunition counts with the grim efficiency of men who knew what dawn would bring. Then she walked in. Technical Sergeant Myra Kalsing moved through the tent flap without ceremony, her flight suit dusty from the tarmac, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that had loosened during the flight from Bagram. She carried her helmet under one arm, the worn padding visible where her head had rested through 1,000 hours of flight time. Hallbrook glanced up, his expression shifting from concentration to something closer to irritation. "You're the CAS they sent." His tone carried the weight of disappointment. Close air support was supposed to mean F-16s or Apache gunships, not a single A-10 Thunderbolt piloted by someone who looked like she should still be instructing cadets stateside. Myra met his gaze without flinching, her brown eyes steady. "Yes, sir. Technical Sergeant Kalsing, call sign Bodhisattva." Hallbrook's operations officer, Captain Ross, suppressed a smirk. The call sign seemed almost ridiculous, too spiritual, too soft for the brutal calculus of combat aviation. Hallbrook straightened, his hand still resting on the map. "We need precision strikes on enemy concentrations here, here, and here." He tapped 3 locations with his index finger. "Can you handle that?" There was doubt in his voice, thinly veiled. Myra stepped closer to the table, studying the map with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read terrain from 15,000 feet. "The A-10 can handle anything, sir." Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "What's the timeline?" Hallbrook checked his watch. "Enemy movement suggests first contact at 0500. Sunrise is 0545. We'll need you overhead before first light." Myra nodded once, then turned to leave. Captain Ross called after her, his voice carrying a note of casual condescension. "Try not to hit our guys, Sergeant." She paused at the tent flap, glanced back over her shoulder, and said nothing. Then she was gone, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness where her aircraft waited. Outside, the A-10 Thunderbolt sat on the makeshift airstrip like a predator at rest. The aircraft was ugly by design. A flying gun platform built around the GAU-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel rotary cannon that fired 30mm, depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 65 per second. The titanium bathtub that encased the cockpit could withstand direct hits from anti-aircraft fire. The twin engines were mounted high on the fuselage, protected from ground fire and heat-seeking missiles. Every inch of the aircraft was designed for one purpose: to fly low, slow, and survivable over the battlefield, delivering devastating firepower where it was needed most. Myra performed her pre-flight inspection with ritualistic precision, her gloved hands checking control surfaces, fuel lines, and weapons pylons. 11 hardpoints carried Maverick missiles, Hydra rocket pods, and 2,000 rounds of ammunition for the cannon. She climbed into the cockpit, strapped herself in, and powered up the systems. The heads-up display flickered to life, projecting flight data onto the glass canopy in front of her. The tower cleared her for takeoff. Myra taxied to the runway, applied throttle, and felt the Thunderbolt surge forward. The nose lifted, the wheels left the ground, and the mountains fell away beneath her. She climbed into the darkness, heading northwest toward Firebase Keating. The stars were still visible overhead, bright and indifferent. Myra checked her instruments, adjusted her heading, and began her descent toward the valley. The radio came alive with chatter, ground units reporting movement, thermal imaging detecting heat signatures along the ridgelines. Hallbrook's voice cut through the noise. "Bodhisattva, this is Firebase Actual. We have confirmed enemy positions moving into engagement range. Request immediate close air support. Danger close. Danger close. The phrase meant friendly forces were within 600 meters of the target. One mistake, one degree of error, and she would be killing the men she was supposed to protect. Myra's hands tightened on the control stick. Firebase actual, Bodhisattva copies. Beginning attack run. The valley opened below her like a wound in the earth. Myra descended to 2,000 feet, low enough to see individual figures moving through the shadows, high enough to avoid small arms fire. Her targeting pod locked onto the first concentration of enemy fighters, a cluster of heat signatures gathered near a stone compound on the eastern ridge. She toggled the weapon selector to Maverick missiles, designated the target, and waited for the lock tone. The missile launched with a violent kick, trailing white smoke as it streaked toward the compound. The explosion lit up the valley, a fireball that rolled upward into the pre-dawn sky. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition caches ignited. Myra banked hard left, coming around for another pass. Ground fire erupted from multiple positions, green tracers arcing up toward her aircraft. The A-10 shuddered as rounds struck the fuselage, but the titanium armor held. She lined up on the second target, a group of fighters using a narrow gorge as cover. This time she selected the cannon. The trigger depressed, and the GAU-8 roared to life with a sound like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times. The depleted uranium rounds chewed through rock and flesh with equal indifference. Holbrook watched from the firebase perimeter, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The A-10 circled the valley like a bird of prey, methodical and relentless. Each pass brought another explosion, another plume of smoke rising into the morning air. The enemy advance slowed, then faltered. Insurgent fighters broke cover, running for the ridgelines, and the A-10 followed them. Myra's voice came over the radio, calm and precise. Firebase actual, Bodhisattva. Enemy forces fragmenting. Pursuing targets northwest toward high ground. Captain Ross stood beside Holbrook, his earlier smirk gone. "She's actually doing it," he said quietly. Holbrook didn't respond. He was watching the way the A-10 maneuvered, tight turns, low altitude, absolute confidence. This wasn't luck. This was skill honed over years of flight time, the kind of instinct that couldn't be taught in a simulator. The sun crested the mountains, flooding the valley with golden light. The battle was far from over, but the tide had turned. Myra brought the Thunderbolt around for another pass, her eyes scanning the terrain below. She spotted a mortar team setting up on a plateau, the crew scrambling to assemble the weapon. She rolled in hot, cannon spooling up. The rounds impacted with surgical precision, turning the mortar position into a crater. Myra pulled up sharply, gaining altitude, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The radio crackled. "Bodhisattva, Firebase actual, you just saved our asses. Enemy is in full retreat." Holbrook's voice carried a note of genuine respect now, the condescension burned away by the reality of what he'd witnessed. Myra keyed her mic. "Firebase actual, Bodhisattva. Still have ordnance remaining. Recommend I maintain station overhead." Holbrook paused, then replied, "Affirmative, Bodhisattva. Stay close. We're not out of this yet." Myra circled the valley, her eyes never leaving the ground. Below, soldiers emerged from their positions, waving up at the A-10. She didn't wave back. Sentimentality was a luxury combat pilots couldn't afford. But she felt the weight of their gratitude, the knowledge that 70 men were alive because she had done her job. The sky was clear now, the smoke from the strikes drifting eastward on the wind. Myra thought about the call sign Captain Ross had mocked, Bodhisattva. In Tibetan Buddhism, a bodhisattva was one who delayed their own enlightenment to save others from suffering. Her instructor at flight school had given her the name after she'd risked a landing in zero visibility to evacuate wounded Marines. The hours passed slowly. Myra remained on station, flying lazy circles over the firebase, her fuel gauge steadily dropping. Twice more she engaged enemy position, small groups of fighters attempting to regroup on the ridgelines. Each time the cannon spoke its terrible language and the enemy scattered. By noon, her fuel was critical. She radioed the firebase. "Firebase actual, Bodhisattva. Winchester and Bingo fuel, returning to base. Holbrook's response was immediate. Bodhisattva, Firebase Actual. You have our deepest thanks. Safe flight home. Myra turned southeast, climbing into clearer skies, leaving the valley behind. The Thunderbolt's engines hummed steadily, reliable as always. She glanced at the photograph taped to her instrument panel, a picture of her grandmother, a Tibetan woman who had fled Chinese occupation in the 1950s, walking barefoot over the Himalayas to reach India. Her grandmother had never spoken much about the journey, but her eyes had held the weight of it until the day she died. Myra flew the same way her grandmother had walked, with quiet determination, one step at a time, carrying others when she could. The airstrip at Bagram appeared on the horizon. Myra began her descent, configuring the aircraft for landing. The wheels touched down with a gentle thump. She taxied to the maintenance area, shut down the engines, and sat in the sudden silence of the cockpit. Her hands trembled slightly now that the mission was over. She allowed herself one deep breath, then unbuckled and climbed down from the aircraft. The crew chief was waiting, a weathered master sergeant named Alvarez who had been turning wrenches on A-10 since the first Gulf War. He walked around the aircraft, inspecting the damage. You took some hits, he said, pointing to the pockmarks in the fuselage where bullets had struck. Myra nodded. She held together, Alvarez grinned. Always does, that's why we call her the Warthog, ugly, tough, and too mean to die. Myra allowed herself a small smile. She patted the aircraft's nose, the metal still warm from the flight, then headed toward the debriefing room. Inside, Major Holbrook was waiting. He stood when she entered, a gesture of respect she hadn't expected. Sergeant Kalsing, he said, I owe you an apology. I doubted your ability. That was unprofessional and wrong. Myra met his eyes. You don't owe me anything, sir. I did my job. Holbrook shook his head. You did more than that. You turned a potential massacre into a defensive victory. The men at that firebase are alive because of you. He extended his hand. Myra shook it, her grip firm. Captain Ross appeared in the doorway, his expression subdued. Sergeant, I'm sorry for what I said before you launched. It was out of line. Myra looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Apology accepted, Captain. Ross shifted uncomfortably. Can I ask you something? Your call sign Bodhisattva. What does it mean? Myra hesitated. She rarely explained the name, but something in Ross's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than mockery. In Buddhism, a bodhisattva is someone who chooses to help others reach enlightenment before seeking their own. In aviation, it means you don't leave anyone behind. Ross absorbed this, then nodded slowly. It suits you. Holbrook cleared his throat. Get some rest, Sergeant. You've earned it. Myra saluted, then left the room. Outside, the Afghan sun blazed in a cloudless sky. She walked toward her quarters, her flight suit stiff with dried sweat. Other pilots passed her, some offering nods of acknowledgement. Word of the mission had spread quickly. The following weeks brought more missions. Myra flew close air support for convoys ambushed on mountain roads, provided overwatch for special operations teams deep in hostile territory, and delivered ordnance on enemy strongholds that had resisted conventional assault. Each mission was different, but the pattern remained the same. Ground forces in desperate need, the descending like an avenging angel, and Myra's calm voice over the radio as she systematically dismantled the threat. Her reputation grew. Soldiers began requesting her by call sign. Get Bodhisattva overhead and we'll be fine, became a common refrain. Other pilots noticed too. The A-10 community was small, tight-knit, and fiercely protective of its own. Myra was invited to briefings she hadn't been included in before. Senior officers sought her input on tactics. She remained humble, deflecting praise, focused always on the next mission. But there was one mission that changed everything. It came on a clear October morning, the kind of day when the mountains looked close enough to touch. A reconnaissance team, call sign Viper 6, had been compromised deep in Taliban territory. Surrounded, outnumbered, and running low on ammunition, they called for immediate extraction. The problem was the landing zone. It was a narrow shelf of rock on a cliff face, barely wide enough for a helicopter to hover. Enemy fighters controlled the high ground on 3 sides. The extraction bird would be a sitting duck without air support. Myra was overhead within 20 minutes, her Thunderbolt loaded with a full weapons complement. She circled the area, studying the terrain. The enemy had chosen their position well, mutually supporting fighting positions dug into the rock, fields of fire that covered every approach to the shelf. Taking them out without hitting the recon team would require precision she had never attempted before. The extraction helicopter, a Chinook call sign Dustoff 3, held at a safe distance. The pilot's voice was tense. Bodhisattva Dustoff 3, can you clear those positions? Myra didn't answer immediately. She was calculating angles, visualizing the attack run. Finally, she keyed her mic. Dustoff 3, Bodhisattva, stand by. She rolled the A-10 into a steep dive, descending toward the cliff face at a suicidal angle. The ground rushed up to meet her, rock and scree filling her canopy. At the last possible moment, she pulled up, leveled out, and opened fire. The cannon roared, a stream of depleted uranium rounds raking the enemy positions. Rock exploded into shrapnel, bodies tumbled from fighting positions. Myra pulled up hard, banking left, then rolled in for another pass. Enemy fire intensified, heavy machine guns, RPGs, tracers filling the sky. The A-10 took multiple hits, but Myra ignored the warnings flashing on her instrument panel. She lined up on the second set of positions and fired again. The cannon's roar echoed off the mountains, a sound like the earth itself splitting open. The enemy fire slackened. Myra keyed her mic. Dustoff 3, Bodhisattva. LZ is clear, move now. The Chinook thundered forward, its twin rotors beating the thin mountain air. It reached the shelf, hovered, and the recon team scrambled aboard 6 men, exhausted and bloodied but alive. The helicopter lifted off, gained altitude, and cleared the area. Myra circled overhead, providing cover until the Chinook was safely out of range. Only then did she allow herself to assess her own aircraft. The damage was extensive. Hydraulic pressure dropping, fuel leak in the left wing tank, multiple systems degraded. She nursed the Thunderbolt back to Bagram, coaxing it through the sky with gentle inputs, whispering encouragement to the machine that had carried her through so many battles. She landed hard, the damaged landing gear barely holding. The aircraft rolled to a stop and Myra shut down the engines. She sat in the cockpit for a long moment, her heart pounding, her hands shaking violently now. Then she climbed out. Alvarez was waiting, his face pale as he surveyed the damage. Jesus, Sergeant, how did you even fly this thing back? Myra didn't answer. She walked away from the aircraft, needing distance, needing air. Behind her, the maintenance crew swarmed over the Thunderbolt, already assessing what could be repaired. The recon team found her that evening. 6 Green Berets, their uniforms still caked with dust and blood, approached her as she sat outside her quarters. The team leader, a captain named Harlow, extended his hand. Sergeant Kalsang, my team owes you our lives. Myra stood, shook his hand. I'm glad you made it out, sir. Harlow shook his head. That was the most insane flying I've ever witnessed. You came so close to that cliff face I thought you were going to crash. Myra shrugged. The A-10 can take it. One of the other team members, a younger soldier with a bandaged arm, spoke up. We heard them on their radios afterward. The Taliban fighters, they were terrified. They kept saying there was a demon in the sky, something that couldn't be killed. Myra felt a chill run down her spine. She thought of her grandmother again, walking through the Himalayas, pursued by soldiers who wanted to erase her culture, her identity, her existence. Her grandmother had survived not through violence but through will, through the refusal to surrender. Myra flew the same way. Harlow pulled something from his pocket, a unit patch, the Viper 6 insignia. We want you to have this. You're part of our team now. Myra took the patch, felt the weight of it in her hand. Thank you, sir. The team left, disappearing into the night. Myra returned to her quarters, pinned the patch to the wall above her bunk, and lay down. Sleep came slowly, tangled with images of the cliff face, the enemy positions, the Chinook lifting off with its precious cargo. When morning came, she rose, dressed, and reported for duty. There were always more missions. The war ground on with the pitiless inevitability of a glacier. Myra flew them all: escort missions, strikes on high-value targets, danger-close support for troops in contact. Each mission added another layer to her reputation. Stories circulated through the forward operating bases and combat outposts scattered across Afghanistan. The sergeant who flew so low she clipped tree branches. The pilot who could put a missile through a window at 3,000 meters. The woman who never lost a soldier she was assigned to protect. Some of the stories were exaggerations, embellished with each retelling. But the core truth remained. Myra Kalsing was the pilot you wanted overhead when everything went to hell. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Davies, called her into his office one afternoon. Davies was an old-school aviator, gray-haired and gruff, a veteran of Desert Storm who had flown A-10s when the airframe was still relatively new. He gestured for Myra to sit. "Sergeant, I'm putting you in for a Medal Distinguished Flying Cross. The paperwork is already moving through channels." Myra shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I was just doing my job." Davies leaned back in his chair. "That's what everyone says. But there's doing your job, and then there's what you've been doing. You've flown more combat hours in the past 6 months than most pilots fly in their entire careers. Your kill count is classified, but let's just say it's impressive. More importantly, you've saved lives, a lot of lives." Myra didn't know what to say. Davies continued. "You know what the ground troops call you, the Angel of the Valley. They think you're invincible." Myra shook her head. "I'm not, sir. I've been lucky." Davies smiled, a rare expression. "Luck is part of it, but so is skill and courage and a willingness to fly into situations that would make other pilots turn around. That's not luck, Sergeant. That's who you are." Myra left the office feeling unsettled. She had never sought recognition, never wanted to be a symbol. She just wanted to fly, to protect the soldiers on the ground, to honor her grandmother's memory by refusing to let others suffer if she could prevent it. But the weight of expectation was growing heavier. In December, as winter settled over the mountains and the fighting slowed, Myra received orders for a 2-week leave. She flew back to the United States, to the small apartment in Colorado Springs where she lived when not deployed. The city felt alien after months in Afghanistan, too clean, too quiet, too disconnected from the reality she had left behind. She visited her mother, who lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town. Her mother was Tibetan American, second generation, a nurse who had raised Myra alone after her father, an Air Force mechanic, had died in a training accident when Myra was 7. They sat in the kitchen drinking tea, the silence between them comfortable. Her mother finally spoke. "You look tired." Myra smiled faintly. "I am." Her mother reached across the table, took her hand. "Your grandmother would be proud of you. You know that, don't you?" Myra felt her throat tight. "I hope so." Her mother squeezed her hand. "She walked so you could fly. Remember that." The word stayed with Myra through the rest of her leave, through the quiet days and restless nights. She returned to Afghanistan in January, just as the fighting season began anew. The Taliban had regrouped over the winter, and intelligence indicated a major offensive was imminent. Myra was assigned to a forward operating base near the Pakistan border, a desolate outpost surrounded by mountains and scrub. The other pilots there were a mix of personalities, some cocky, some cynical, all competent. But Myra kept to herself, focused on her missions. Then came the day that would define her legacy. The mission briefing was routine: provide air support for a convoy moving through a mountain pass known for ambushes. Myra launched at dawn, flying northeast toward the convoy's route. The morning was clear, the mountains stark against the pale sky. She established radio contact with the convoy commander, a gruff lieutenant colonel named Patterson. "Bodhisattva, convoy actual. Glad to have you overhead." Myra keyed her mic. "Convoy actual, Bodhisattva. I have you visual, proceeding to overwatch position." She climbed to 5,000 feet, circling the convoy as it wound its way through the pass. For the first hour, nothing happened. Then the world exploded. The ambush was massive, coordinated attacks from multiple positions, RPGs and heavy machine gun fire raking the convoy from both sides of the pass. 3 vehicles were hit in the first 30 seconds, one of them a fuel truck that erupted in a fireball. The convoy ground to a halt, pinned down, taking casualties. Patterson's voice over the radio was tight with controlled panic. "Bodhisattva, convoy actual. We are taking effective fire from both flanks. Request immediate air support." Myra rolled the A-10 into a dive, her eyes scanning the terrain. The enemy had positioned themselves brilliantly, hidden among the rocks, fields of fire that interlocked perfectly. She designated the first target, a cluster of fighters on the western ridge, and fired a Maverick missile. The explosion sent bodies tumbling down the slope. She pulled up, banked hard, and came around for another pass. The cannon spun up, and she walked fire along the eastern ridge, chewing through rock and flesh. But there were too many of them. For every position she destroyed, two more opened fire. The convoy was being torn apart. Soldiers scrambled for cover, dragging wounded comrades behind disabled vehicles. Myra's fuel gauge was dropping, her ordnance depleting. She keyed her mic, speaking directly to Patterson. "Convoy actual, Bodhisattva, you need to move. Now, I'll keep them suppressed, but you have to get out of the kill zone." Patterson's reply was grim. "Bodhisattva, we have wounded, we can't move. If we leave them, they're dead." Myra didn't hesitate. "Then I'll stay until you can get them out." She dove again, lower this time, so close to the ground that she could see the faces of the enemy fighters. The cannon roared and the fighters scattered. She pulled up, rolled inverted, and dove again from a different angle. The A-10 shuddered under the impact of return fire, but she ignored it. Below, soldiers were loading the wounded into the remaining vehicles. Patterson's voice cut through the chaos. "Bodhisattva, we're moving. All vehicles mobile." Myra climbed, providing cover as the convoy accelerated out of the pass. Enemy fire followed them, but the intensity was lessening. She had broken the ambush, shattered the enemy's cohesion. The convoy reached clear ground, and Patterson's voice came over the radio, thick with emotion. "Bodhisattva, convoy actual, you saved us, again." Myra didn't respond. Her fuel gauge was redlining, warning lights flashing across the instrument panel. She turned south, heading for the nearest airstrip, coaxing every last mile out of the thunderbolt. The airstrip appeared on the horizon, a ribbon of concrete in the desert. She lined up for landing, extended the gear, and felt the familiar thump as the wheels locked into place. The touchdown was rough, the aircraft skidding slightly as she applied the brakes. She taxied to a stop, shut down the engines, and sat in the sudden silence. Her hands were shaking again, her heart pounding. She had flown missions like this before, but each one took something from her, a piece of her nerve, a fragment of her confidence. She climbed out of the cockpit, her legs unsteady. Alvarez was there as always. He looked at the aircraft, then at her. "You need to stop doing this to yourself, Sergeant." Myra met his eyes. "I can't." He sighed, shook his head. "I know, that's the problem." The weeks that followed blurred together. More missions, more firefights, more narrow escapes. Myra flew until her body ached, until sleep became a distant memory. She was running on adrenaline and determination, held together by force of will. Lieutenant Colonel Davies called her into his office again. This time his expression was serious. "Sergeant, I'm grounding you." Myra stared at him. "Sir, I'm fine." Davies shook his head. "No, you're not. You've flown 60 combat missions in 4 months. You're exhausted. You're making mistakes." Myra's jaw tightened. "What mistakes?" Davies pulled out a report. "2 days ago, you flew through a thunderstorm to reach a unit in contact. You could have waited for the weather to clear, but you didn't. You risked your life and your aircraft unnecessarily." Myra's voice was cold. "That unit needed air support. I provided it." Davies leaned forward. "And if you had crashed, if you had died, how many soldiers would lose their guardian angel then?" The words hit Myra like a physical blow. She had never thought of it that way, never considered that her willingness to risk everything might itself be a form of selfishness. Davies softened his tone. "You're one of the best combat pilots I've ever seen, but you're human, you need rest. That's an order, Sergeant." Myra wanted to argue, to protest, but the exhaustion she had been ignoring suddenly crashed over her like a wave. She nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Davies stood, walked around the desk, and put a hand on her shoulder. "Get some sleep. The war will still be here when you wake up." Myra left the office, walked to her quarters, and collapsed onto her bunk. She slept for 16 hours straight, a dreamless sleep so deep it felt like death. When she woke, the sun was setting, painting the Afghan sky in shades of orange and purple. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about her grandmother. Thinking about the soldiers she had saved, the missions she had flown, the weight of expectation that pressed down on her with every breath. She thought about the call sign Bodhisattva and what it truly meant, to delay one's own peace to ease the suffering of others. She had lived that philosophy without fully understanding it, had flown into fire again and again because she could not bear to let others die if she had the power to prevent it. But Davies was right. She couldn't save everyone. She couldn't fly forever. Eventually, the war would take her too, whether through enemy fire or simple exhaustion. The question was whether her sacrifice would mean something, or whether it would simply be another name on a memorial wall, another statistic in a conflict that seemed to have no end. Myra rose from her bunk, walked outside. The base was quiet, the day's missions concluded. She looked up at the sky, at the stars beginning to emerge in the deepening twilight. Somewhere out there, soldiers were standing watch, manning checkpoints, patrolling hostile villages. And somewhere, another pilot was strapping into an A-10, preparing to provide the cover they needed to survive the night. The war would continue with or without her, but while she was still here, while she could still fly, she would do what she had always done. She would be the angel they called for, the guardian overhead, the voice on the radio that meant salvation was coming. The next morning, rested and clear-headed for the first time in months, Myra reported for duty. Davies looked surprised to see her. "I thought you'd take more than one day off." Myra shrugged. "I slept. I'm ready." Davies studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. There's a mission briefing in 30 minutes. Ground forces are planning a raid on a Taliban compound. They'll need air support." Myra nodded, turned to leave. Davies called after her. "Sergeant, fly smart, not just brave." Myra glanced back, offered a small smile. "Yes, sir." The mission went smoothly, a textbook raid, providing overwatch while special operations teams cleared the compound. No casualties, no complications. When it was over, the team leader radioed his thanks, and Myra returned to base. It felt good to fly a mission that didn't end in chaos, that didn't push her to the edge of her limits. Over the following weeks, something shifted. Myra still flew as many missions as anyone else, still provided the same lethal precision that had become her trademark. But she was more careful now, more measured. She took Davies' words to heart: fly smart, not just brave. She began mentoring younger pilots, sharing the lessons she had learned through hard experience. She taught them how to read terrain from altitude, how to communicate with ground forces, how to stay calm when tracers were arcing up toward the cockpit. Some of them listened with wide-eyed reverence, treating her like a legend. Others were more skeptical, until they flew with her and saw firsthand how she operated. Gradually, Myra realized that her legacy wouldn't just be the missions she flew, but the knowledge she passed on, the skills she imparted to the next generation of pilots who would carry on when she was gone. In March, the Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony was held at Bagram. Myra stood at attention while Lieutenant Colonel Davies read the citation, detailing her actions over Firebase Keating and a dozen other engagements. The medal was pinned to her uniform, and the assembled personnel applauded. Myra felt uncomfortable with the attention, but she endured it because it mattered to the soldiers who had fought beside her. After the ceremony, Major Holbrook approached her. He had rotated back to Afghanistan for another deployment and had specifically requested to work with her again. "Congratulations, Sergeant. Well deserved." Myra shook his hand. "Thank you, sir." Holbrook's expression grew serious. "I wanted to apologize again for doubting you that first day. I've thought about it a lot, and I realize my doubts had nothing to do with your qualifications. I let prejudice cloud my judgment." Myra appreciated his honesty. "We all have biases, sir. What matters is recognizing them and moving past them." Holbrook nodded. "You've changed a lot of minds here, Sergeant, mine included. You've shown everyone what competence and courage look like, regardless of gender or background." Myra thought about the long road that had brought her to this moment, the years of flight training, the doubts from instructors who thought women didn't belong in combat aviation, the quiet determination that had carried her through every challenge. "I didn't do it to prove a point, sir. I did it because it needed to be done." Holbrook smiled. "That's exactly why it mattered." The deployment ended in May. Myra packed her gear, said her goodbyes, and boarded a transport plane bound for the United States. As the plane climbed into the sky, she looked down at Afghanistan one last time. The mountains, the valleys, the scars of war etched into the landscape. She thought about all the missions she had flown, the soldiers she had saved, the enemies she had killed. She thought about her grandmother walking through those same mountains half a century ago, fleeing persecution, seeking freedom. Myra had walked that path too in her own way. She had flown through fire, faced death with every mission, and emerged on the other side still standing. The plane leveled off, heading west. Myra closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to rest. When she opened them again, they were over the Atlantic, the ocean stretching endlessly below. She was going home. But she knew with absolute certainty that part of her would always remain in those Afghan skis, circling overhead, watching for threats, ready to dive into the chaos one more time to bring someone home.